In the medieval world, marriage was far from the personal choice we associate with it today. Instead of love and compatibility, it was driven by family interests, social status, and economic necessity. Men often married not out of affection, but to secure alliances, wealth, and power. Marriages were more about duty than desire, with customs that varied between commoners and nobles. In this video, we'll explore how these marriages were arranged, the rituals involved, and what they reveal about medieval society. Marriage in the medieval period was rarely a matter of personal preference or romantic love. Instead, it was a social contract heavily influenced by family expectations, social status, and economic factors. For men, particularly in the noble classes, the challenge of marriage was often centered around securing power, wealth, and alliances, rather than pursuing a love connection. In essence, the ideal bride was less about mutual affection and more about bolstering family reputation and ensuring the survival of bloodlines. For commoners, the reality was harsh. One of the biggest challenges commoners faced when marrying was the pressure to marry within their social class. Marriage was viewed as a necessary economic transaction. Marrying into a family with land, resources, or skills could provide a sense of security, but love rarely played a role in these decisions. Men were often expected to marry a woman who could provide the material support necessary to ensure the family's well-being. If they were lucky, they may have been able to marry a woman they were somewhat fond of. However, for the majority, especially those from the noble class, the decision was often made by their parents or other family members. In the case of noble families, marriage was not simply an arrangement between two individuals, but an alliance between entire families, with far-reaching political and economic consequences. Marriages between noble families were strategically planned to cement power, expand territories, or increase wealth. For men in these families, the challenge was that their brides were often chosen based on the political and financial benefits they would bring. It didn't matter if there was no chemistry between the couple or if they didn't even know each other well before the wedding. The alliance was paramount. The challenge of medieval marriage for men was not only deciding whom to marry, but also the role of family and community in enforcing this decision. In many cases, women had little to no say in who they were to marry. Marriages were often arranged long before the bride and groom met, and families placed the burden on their soon-to-be couple to ensure that the marriage and the resulting union of properties or political alliances was successful. These decisions were so crucial that the happiness or emotional state of the couple was rarely considered in the process. For a nobleman, to object to his parents' choice could lead to serious consequences, including being disinherited or shunned from the family's political networks. The concept of marriage during this time was also tied to the idea of lineage and inheritance. Some men marry a woman so that she can bear him children, ideally male heirs to inherit their property or noble title. If a man were unlucky enough to be married to a woman who failed to produce children or, worse yet, failed to produce male heirs, it could have significant implications on his standing in society. This added pressure to the already challenging social dynamics. That was why some customs involved proving a woman's fertility before marriage. In some cultures, it wasn't enough for a woman to merely be engaged or courted. She had to prove her ability to conceive during the courtship period. If she failed to become pregnant within the set time frame, the marriage was called off. This was seen as proof of her fertility, which was deemed essential for her to fulfill her role as a wife. The pressure on women to meet these physical expectations was immense, leaving little room for personal agency or any consideration for their health and well-being. For men, marriage was not only an opportunity to secure political power, but it was also a deeply ingrained duty in maintaining family legacies. The lack of emotional connection between husband and wife often meant that the relationship was purely functional. In a time when the primary purpose of marriage was to create heirs and secure wealth, personal affection was not a prerequisite. In fact, many medieval marriages were seen as an obligation to family, society, and the greater good. The pressure to fulfill this duty was immense, particularly when arranged marriages were often carried out at a young age. In many ancient and medieval cultures, the expectations surrounding a woman's purity and fertility were incredibly strict and often influenced the marriage process. One of the most significant cultural norms was the belief that a woman had to be undefiled, meaning she had to be a virgin before marriage. This belief was deeply rooted in the idea of preserving family honor and ensuring the legitimacy of offspring. In some cultures, a woman's virginity was so important that it had to be publicly proven. For example, after the wedding night, it was customary in certain communities to hang a blood-stained sheet out of the window, to demonstrate that the bride had consummated the marriage and, crucially, that she was indeed a virgin. This practice, often seen as a mark of pride and honor for the bride's family, feels incredibly barbaric by modern standards. The journey from betrothal to marriage in medieval times was not as simple as today's modern dating system. In fact, it was a structured, often drawn-out process that involved numerous stages, customs, and rituals, many of which have long since disappeared from contemporary marriage practices. These stages were heavily influenced by social, economic, and religious expectations. Unlike today, where dating precedes a proposal, some medieval marriages began with a formal betrothal. This was not a casual engagement, it was a legally binding agreement, often made years before the actual wedding. Families would negotiate terms, and the agreement was typically solidified through a contract that outlined the dowry. For men, this stage was significant because it often meant their families had already decided whom they would marry, and the betrothal was simply the formal acknowledgement of that decision. At this point, the couple did not necessarily know each other very well. The idea of falling in love or developing emotional attachment was secondary to the practical considerations of securing an alliance and future heirs. Once the betrothal was official, the bride and groom could no longer marry anyone else without breaching the contract. However, they were not yet married, and the marriage would take place later, sometimes years after the betrothal. For men, this stage could involve months or even years of waiting, as the betrothal often served to secure a strategic partnership, giving both families time to prepare for the wedding. Then comes the wedding, which was an event steeped in ritual and community participation. Medieval weddings were often grand, public affairs, especially for noble families. It wasn't just a ceremony for the couple, it was a communal celebration of alliances and family honor. The marriage was as much about uniting two families as it was about uniting the couple. The public nature of the wedding allowed the community to witness the couple's commitment, reinforcing the social contract of marriage. For commoners, the wedding ceremony was simpler but no less significant. It would typically take place in a local church or chapel with family and friends in attendance. The couple would exchange vows and witness the formalization of the union, but the celebrations would be far more modest than those of the nobility. Nonetheless, the ceremony was still a highly significant event in their lives, often marked by a feast afterwards to celebrate the new union. Another key element of medieval marriages was the dowry, a transfer of property, money, or goods from the bride's family to the groom's. This practice was particularly important for men as it often provided them with material resources to begin their new life with their bride. For noble families, dowries could include land, jewelry, or even military support, while for commoners, the dowry might include livestock, household goods, or nothing but a simple "I do." The dowry was a way of ensuring that the marriage had financial backing, but it also served to legitimize the union. It was a guarantee that the bride's family would support the marriage, ensuring that the groom would be responsible for the bride's welfare. The families often negotiated the dowry before the wedding, and for men, it represented both a financial boon and a weighty obligation. If the marriage failed, it could result in the loss of a substantial sum. Following the wedding, another significant ritual took place, which was the bedding ceremony. This involved the couple being led to their bedchamber, where they consummated the marriage. This practice served to prove the marriage was legitimate in both social and legal senses. For men, it was a public declaration of the marriage's validity, ensuring that they could claim the marriage was completed in accordance with social customs. While the basic structure of marriage rituals was similar across medieval Europe, local customs varied widely. In Italy, for example, it was common for the marriage to be formalized in the presence of a notary, and only then could the wedding feast take place. This practice reflected the importance of legal formality in marriages, with the church and legal systems closely intertwined in marriage matters. In other regions, such as England, marriage rituals were often more elaborate, featuring grand feasts, jousts, and celebrations that lasted for days. In medieval times, women were often married off at shockingly young ages, sometimes as early as 12 or 13. That's a far cry from today's laws, where the legal age for marriage is usually 18 or older in most countries. Back then, age was no guarantee of emotional or physical maturity, yet marriages were still arranged, and often without a choice. It wasn't uncommon for women to be married off to older men, many years their senior, a practice that was largely tied to family strategy, not personal readiness. And then there's the charivari. This was a fascinating custom where the community would mock couples who didn't quite fit the social norm. If, for example, a young man married an older woman, or vice versa, the villagers would often hold a charivari to mock the union in a humorous manner. It was a public spectacle, poking fun at the couple's perceived mismatch. While that might seem cruel today, back then, it was just another part of the marriage process. We may look at such age gaps today and see them as nothing more than a choice, but back then, they were cause for public jest. Finally, let's talk talk about divorce. It was practically unheard of. Unlike today, where divorce can be a relatively straightforward legal process, medieval marriages were almost indissoluble. The church and state had significant control over marital unions, and breaking them apart was nearly impossible for the majority of people. Women, especially, had few avenues for escaping an unhappy or abusive marriage. In medieval times, marriage was shaped by strict cultural expectations that placed immense pressure on women, from having no say in who you marry and using marriage as a political and social economic boost to virginity and demonstrating fertility. These practices, although common at the time, are now viewed as outdated and oppressive. Today, marriage is about personal choice, love, and equality, not societal or familial duty. What do you think about these medieval marriage customs? How do you think they shaped the roles of women back then? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos for more surprising insights into history.